Hi there, Mr. Hammer. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for
Good.
inviting me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. I'm sorry if you were waiting. All right. So I think I've got folks trickling in now. So I will just quickly welcome everybody who's joined us and thank you very much for setting aside a little bit of time out of your schedule this evening. Um, Tonight's forum has been organized by Somerset resident Amalia Levitin, who will be introducing her panel as well. Amalia currently serves on the town's Equity and Inclusion Committee and has been in contact with the mayor and council about various other ways to improve and increase youth involvement in town of Somerset operations and decision making. And one of the ideas that Amalia had brought up was expanding the right to vote to Somerset residents who are 16 and 17. Currently, Somerset's charter allows any resident over 18 to vote. And Amalia has found a few model municipalities in the state of Maryland, and has also done some other research into this topic and wanted to set up an opportunity to discuss it, what some of the ramifications of those decisions are, and some other things related to it that the town might consider as the council and residents consider this topic themselves. And so with that, Amalia, I will turn it over to you. Let me just say quickly before you have the keys that this meeting is being recorded. And so we'll be posting this on the town website and creating a link that we can share for folks. If you have a question that you might want addressed at some point, feel free to send it via the chat function to either myself or to Amalia. And if for some reason this meeting gets interrupted in some way that we're not able to continue on, what we'll plan to do is just end the meeting and dispense a new link for folks to join so that we can resume the meeting uninterrupted. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Amalia.
Thank you, Matt. And again, thank you so much to all the wonderful panelists who have joined us tonight. I just wanted to give a brief overview of what we're going to do tonight and kind of what we're going to get out of this. So as Matt said, currently the voting age in Somerset, as it is in most of the rest of the country, is 18. I am trying to change that voting age in Somerset to be 16. So tonight we have 5 wonderful panelists with us. First, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Michael Hanmer, who is at the University of Maryland in the Department of Government and Politics. He is also research director for the Center of Democracy and Civic Engagement and specializes in American politics and political methodology. Then we're going to hear some testimonials from different officials and teens who are a part of municipalities where there is a lowered voting age. So we're going to hear from Patrick Pashal, who is currently the American Rescue Plan Fund Program Manager for the city of Hyattsville. Previously, he served as a council member and was the lead sponsor of legislation for Hyattsville to lower its voting age back in 2015. We're also going to hear from Talisha Cersei, who serves as the Ward 6 council member for the city of Tacoma Park. Tacoma Park was the first municipality in the whole nation to lower its voting age to 16 back in 2013. And then we also have two young people with us tonight to offer a youth perspective. We have Andreas Geppert, and he is a rising senior at Landon and lives in the neighboring town of Chevy Chase. Recently, he lobbied his town council to lower the voting age, and this past May, he was able to vote in his town election. We also have Julia Maynard, and she is a resident of Tacoma Park, where she is not only able to vote, but also served on the youth council this past year. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to Professor Hanmer.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I was clicking around because I'm going to share my screen, and of course it took extra clicks. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research about voting at 16, provide a little background, and I have a little bit of evidence from Tacoma Park and in Hyattsville to share, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. So I'm going to see if my screen share works here. And hopefully you're seeing my presentation now. Let's see, I need to move some things around. There we go. Okay. As Molly said, I'm Mike Hanmer, professor of government and politics and research director for the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at Maryland. I'm part of the Vote 16 research network, which I helped co-found with a number of colleagues at University of Maryland and elsewhere. And this is, a community-led effort that we're convening at the university to try to understand what happens when communities lower the voting age to 16. What we try to do is bring together young people, local government leaders, community leaders, educators, scholars, to try to co-create research. So in some ways, it's a very different approach than the usual approach of a faculty member sitting in their office and doing research. This really is about bringing other people into the process, and it's been really rewarding and fun. One of the things that I wanted to do is talk a little bit about, just to set the context of some of the motivations and arguments for and against lowering the voting age for 16, and then share with you some of the results from research. So the most common argument that I think people probably talk about is that the idea is that lowering the voting age could actually boost turnout. The idea here is that, as we increase the number of people who participate, we get better outcomes, better candidates, better policy outcomes. And again, if you believe in participatory democracy, that's not really a very controversial argument. We've thought this for a long time in this country, and a lot of evidence has backed that up. There's also a lot of evidence that voting is habit forming. So once people start to vote, the process, the idea, the concern for voting really sinks in, and people tend to vote again. The opposite is also true. Abstinence is habit forming. If you don't vote, then you're less likely to vote in the future. And when it comes to thinking about lowering the voting age to 16 and 17, a lot of the argumentation for thinking about why this would boost turnout, both in the short term and in the long term over someone's lifespan, is that when people are 16 and 17, they have a support network that can provide them with information, provide them with structure. Most 16 and 17-year-olds still live at home with their family. And at 18, we often see transitions. People leave the home to go to college, go to work, and that creates a disruption. It's harder to get registered to vote. You don't necessarily have the same sort of mechanisms in place through your family, your neighbors, and your teachers, for example. There's also a lot of arguments that, by lowering the voting rate, you're going to increase engagement. That is, you're going to give people more of a reason to get involved and to think about what their role is in the community, and maybe get them to participate more in community activities besides just voting, maybe even running for office. Some of the other arguments relate to fairness. At 16, more responsibilities come. You're allowed to work. You have to pay taxes on those wages. And so there's some sense that, well, maybe that they're contributing more than most people think about. And so giving them, the right to vote makes sense. It gives them a say in some of these policies that really influence them. There's also a lot of debate about maturity and whether, people at 16 and 17-year-old are able to, really handle the pressure and handle the responsibility of being a voter. And then another issue relates to decision making. And some of the concerns here are, well, are 16 and 17-year-olds going to make informed decisions? Are they going to make decisions that are consistent with the way they really think about this? Are they going to get the information? Are they going to process the information? Are they going to be too easily influenced by others? Those sorts of issues come up when talking about lowering the voting age. So that's kind of an overview. There's certainly a lot of other arguments that are out there and that people could come up with, but those are sort of the ones that seem to get the most discussion. So now I want to share a little bit about what the research shows, and there's been a lot of research on this topic, mainly from outside of the United States, but certainly some studies in the US as well. So overall, one of the biggest things that jumps out when you start looking at this issue is, a lot of people are skeptical. That's pretty common. But once the policy is implemented, support increases. I'll cite an example from Scotland. The Conservative Party initially was against the policy, but it was put into place around the big referendum, and they saw that it worked okay. And they even saw that there certainly were young people out there, 16 and 17, who were interested in the Conservative Party, and that they could grow a little bit by incorporating them. And so it really was an issue that crossed parties there. And after it's been implemented in other places, support has gone up as well. In terms of turnout, we see what a lot of people had hoped to see, that turnout goes up. Well, 16 and 17-year-olds vote at higher rates, and I'll show you some local evidence in a few slides. At a rate that exceeds 18 to 24-year-olds. We usually think of turnout sort of increasing with age and then dropping off at older ages as people's networks change and it's harder to get around, those sorts of things. But when you see 16 and 17-year-olds able to vote, you see this distribution that has a spike at 16 and 17 in terms of turnout, and then it drops for 18 to 24-year-olds and then starts to steadily climb. So you can boost overall turnout because the rate among 16 and 17-year-olds tends to be very high. There's also a lot of research that shows, in terms of cognitive development, interest in politics, and the extent to which household members might have a sway on people, that 16 and 17-year-olds aren't all that different from other voting eligible young people on all of those dimensions. So we're all influenced by our family members to some degree, and 16 and 17-year-olds aren't being more influenced by their parents and essentially giving their parents a double vote, so to speak. In terms of the coherence of their vote, that is, the matchup of what they say they're interested in and who they actually vote for in their policies, 16 and 17-year-olds are also similar in terms of of that measure as they are to other young people. I also participated in some research recently that looked at what sorts of arguments seem to resonate with the public. And here, the thing that really jumped out was civic competence. So when you tell people that the young people in your community are high on civic skills, that they're interested, that they've worked as election workers, and they're ready to take on this responsibility, that seems to increase people's willingness to support the proposal. And then this is, not a surprise for anybody who's going to come to an event like this. Implementation matters. Or you can have the policy on paper, but unless you really support it, it's not going to go very far. So in the places that really get the community involved and get the schools involved and promote the policy, it tends to work best in terms of engaging people. I now want to just share a couple of slides. So here's some results, and I want to thank Josh Douglas and also officials in Tacoma Park who shared this with him. But Josh Douglas is a member of the Vote 16 Research Network and a law professor at the University of Kentucky who studied this issue. And he shared this with me. And you can see here that in 2013, turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds was 44%, whereas overall turnout was just 10%. So there, you see that you might get really excited, but say, okay, well, that was just a novelty effect. It was the first time, it was a big deal. We're not going to see that sort of, pattern continue. And while the gap certainly decreases, you can see across all the elections, 2014, 15, 17, and 2020, turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds was higher than overall turnout, often by really, really large margins. So in terms of the argument about turnout, it certainly seems to be taking hold. And then I also led a study in Hyattsville in their Ward 1 special election last year. And we saw the pattern that I referenced earlier. Turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds was pretty high, 30%. And then, here actually from 18 to 29, turnout was particularly low, and then it bounces back up for people over 30. So again, showing this common pattern. So if you lower the voting age, in most places we've seen that turnout has actually increased because 16 and 17-year-olds are particularly engaged. They want this in the places where they've lobbied for it, and they follow through. And that's all I had in terms of presentation. I'm happy to answer questions now or later, whatever works best.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Professor Hanmer. Does anybody have any questions right now for him? No? Okay, we'll also have a little short Q&A session at the end. So if you think of anything to ask, just hold on to that. So now we're gonna go to Patrick and Talisha, just to kind of say from their point of view as legislators, kind of what that looked like for their municipality. So Patrick, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'll just sort of give a brief, I guess, introduction into how I came to sort of know the issue of lowering the voting age. I've worked with Mike on the Vote 16 Research Network here in the state of Maryland, and I agree with everything he said, and a lot of the arguments that for and against were arguments that came up in the city of Hyattsville. So my experience was I was at a conference in 2013 and was at a session on how to increase voter engagement and voter turnout across the board. And then State Senator, now Congressman Jamie Raskin, was one of the panelists, and he just had a long list of ideas, and they included establishing early voting and expanding early voting as a thing in various jurisdictions, doing vote by mail, or what was then called absentee voting, establishing same-day voter registration, and then these sort of more novel ideas that only I think Tacoma Park and maybe a few other handful of places have done: 16 to 17-year-old voting and non-citizen resident voting in municipal elections. And so, I took a lot of these ideas back to the city of Hyattsville, and we had discussions and implemented many of them. So that's how I sort of got involved in this movement. But what I found really interesting was that the most powerful thing that was convincing for residents in the city of Hyattsville and for council members in the city of Hyattsville wasn't, the data and the facts. I think the data and the facts help overcome the immediate biases that we all 16-year-olds really able to make these kind of decisions? Well, actually, the data shows yes. Or are they going to vote the same way as their parents? Actually, the data shows no. Are they going to vote at all? Yes, actually, they will. And so we have these sort of hesitations to lowering the voting age that are, I think, a lot of gut reactions based on social norms and social expectations. But the data shows that we're wrong about those. That doesn't get us to yes for a lot of people. That just gets us to, okay, maybe my assumptions weren't correct. Hearing from young folks themselves make the argument about why this is important was the most moving and telling thing for so many members of our community. We had a 15-year-old go live on MSNBC national television and talk about why this was important to her and how she got engaged and why it's important for her to get started with the habit of voting and take interest in what's happening locally and see that her voice really can matter in local elections and can matter in terms of how local officials make their decisions. We heard from a super smart junior in high school talk about his support for this, and that person then went on to be a member of the school board as an elected member by the students, and then elected by the community at large to represent them on the school board. And so, the hearing the voice of the folks who are directly impacted, I think, is probably the most the most eye-opening experience for folks who are initially reluctant to lower the voting age to 16, because a lot of your assumptions about whether these folks can make the kind of decisions and take into account the kind of factors that we want them to take into account, it often blows people away. They're impressed with how much research and reverence and seriousness young people take with being involved with the voting process, like we all should. So I can answer a bunch of questions, of course, about how things went or what the arguments for or against were. But I really want to center the voices of young people in all these discussions because I think you're going to be really impressed to hear what they have to say.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick. Do you mind just elaborating a little bit on how or if you saw any changes in town policies? So do you think that having 16-year-olds voting, 17-year-olds, did that have any major effects on your town?
There are multiple ways that effects can happen. And in terms of have 16-year-old tipped the balance of an election, I'm not sure. Mike probably knows. I do, but I doubt that's true, right? I don't think that we've had any elections that are so close that any single age group or other voting identity group would have actually swayed that election. Does it have an impact on the way that the city governs? Absolutely, right? We have had a major increase in investments for young people and teens in our community. We're building a teen center, and we received grants from the state and county to help fund a teen center in our community. And we have council members and council member candidates who are specifically centering the importance of, did you know you can vote and did you know you can engage as part of their campaign platforms? And I think it's because they agree with and sort of invest in the underlying substantive idea that spreading democracy is good, right? And having more people voting is good. I'm not sure that I am well versed enough in the city's teen specific policies to know what impacts there have been, other than the fact that there, is now a very active teen committee that brings recommendations to council and council considers them. And that's part of our regular process now. They're one of about 20 committees in the city that are specialized topic areas to bring recommendations to council on laws and policy change. And oftentimes those recommendations end up being laws have to be changed to do it, but just like changes in behaviors and approaches, ways of thinking and that sort of stuff. And so then they can be implemented at the staff level.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. So if anybody else has any questions for Patrick, don't be shy, speak up. You can always write them in the chat and I can ask them for you. Okay, we're now going to turn over to Councilmember Saoirse to give her view and Tacoma Park on how they have had a lowered voting age.
Sure. So I was elected onto council in 2015, which was the first voting election post the 16-year-old lowering of the 16-year-old voting age. And all of the pros and cons that we heard earlier were issues that were debated within the city. I think one of the things that from a person who was elected after the voting age was lowered, that I could kind of pick up on where Patrick left off, is the fact that it does change how people who are running for office and how elected officials operate. I think sometimes we work under the misconception that the youth needs are distinctly, they're unique, there's some unique aspects, but they're not very different from what adults in a community want. They want a safe route to get to school. They want to feel safe in the community. They want activities, things to do. They want their voices to be heard. They want to be asked and not told. It's a very similar idea that most adults have when it relates to issues that are going on in a community that the youth have as well. So running for office after the voting age was lowered was really about, I actually had to, not had to do, I wanted to do, but bus stop engagement with youth. I would show up to the bus stops early in the morning when teens are at their freshest and just remind them of the fact that, hey, you can vote in the city. Did you know that you can vote? Do you know how to vote? I'm running for office. I actually had teenagers in my home at that time. And one of the things that was very amazing to see was how they too started to get more involved and more invested in local issues, not just as a result of the fact that I was running for office, but also because their friends were talking about it. So then you have students that live in the city of Tacoma Park. They're waiting around the bus stop. They're now getting materials and they're learning about things that is important happening locally. Maybe they're on the youth council like Julia, and they talk about it. And they go to Blair High School and they talk about it. And then they come up and occasionally show up to a city council meeting and they talk about it. So it becomes more ingrained in how they believe or how they feel they should be or engage in the community. It also impacts how councils do policies, quite frankly. In the city of Tacoma Park, one of the first things that we think about is how we engage the youth council. We're undergoing a library renovation. One of the first things, okay, how do we make sure that we engage the youth council, make sure the youth council is aware of what's happening with the library? How can we work with them to get the word out to the youth about the closure of our library, the renovation? How can we have like a youth summit to kind of talk about things like voting or public safety or any issues that they may have in terms of community engagement or activities or things like that. We try to try to engage the youth council. And it's actually trickled into identifying other ways in which youth can serve on various committees within the city. We've asked ourselves, is there a particular reason why we have an age limit on something like the Arts and Humanities Committee? Why can't youth be involved in those types of groups in addition to the youth council? So it does change how, not just how you do policy, but it also forces you to engage different populations within your community, the more people who have the opportunity to vote. So I think that those are some of the key points. I think a number of the hesitancies that people had initially about lowering the age. For me, I will be candid in saying I was concerned because there were already disparities that existed in the city of Tacoma Park's voter turnout. So for me, I was like, yeah, we can lower the age, but we still have to address the fact that people in our rental, our multifamily, our renters, the turnout is not as high amongst them. We have a lot of youth that live in these buildings. Are we exacerbating those disparities? How are we engaging our undocumented residents? How are we making sure that they know and their youth know? So it's not enough to simply lower the age. You have to also beef up your voter engagement and really trying to pound pavement to make sure that people know that they have the ability to vote and how to register, and it's in multiple languages and that everyone understands. And so for me, that was something that was really important, and then that the city of Tacoma Park really took on hard. And it was interesting to see that data earlier, because 2020 is the first year that the city of Tacoma Park did vote by mail out of necessity because of COVID. But we also saw a huge increase in our turnout as a result. So there's just so many positive things that we've experienced as a result of lowering the age to 16-year-olds being able to vote, that now, looking back, I was like, why was I ever nervous? These kids are smarter than me. Like, they know these issues and they study these issues, and you really are setting the foundation for how youth in your community will civically engage for a lifetime. So thank you so much for having an opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Thank you for sharing all that. I know you touched on this a little bit, but after almost 10 years of letting teens vote, are there any like major insights you've gained?
I think that you should consider voting as step one, right? So allowing youth to vote is step one. They're going to and should rightfully be then more able to participate in other aspects of local government. So we have our youth council. That's great. Now we're seeing youth are interested in other committees. So can we lower certain ages for certain committees to allow youth to be involved in those other ways? It's critically important that you don't just think of it as, well, you get a right to vote, right? You kind of think of the full civic engagement experience that youth should be able to engage in as part of their ability to vote. And I think that's the critical component to ensure not just that people, that youth vote, but that they're civically minded and engaged and kind of understand aspects of how local government work that can kind of take them forward for years to come, but also invest in such a tremendous way to your community. I could not imagine our city without our youth council. They're such a valuable contributor to how we function as a city. So, making sure that you're not just thinking about voting in isolation. It's part of an overall package to ensure that you're able to engage your youth in a meaningful way, and therefore reap the benefits as a city of having more engaged youth in your community.
And we did have some questions come in for you. So one person wants to know, what are the age restrictions for running for council? So I guess actual council versus team council, how do you differentiate those?
Yeah, so actual council is 18. It is 18. But youth, and that was another reason why we have youth council. So youth council is a way for youth in the community to have that council experience. But the actual election age is 18, and that's in part because there are state rules around municipal elections.
And then we also had.
Do you mind if I jump in and comment on this? So we too in Hyattsville have a minimum age of 18 to serve, and this is something that I I personally disagree with, and it's a one of the sub pieces of the legislative battle that I lost when we were trying to move this forward. My personal opinion was at the time, and I articulated in the council, that to say that we are going to allow you to vote but not allow you to serve does seem to me some emptiness in the right to vote. It limits the actual voice and voting power that you have. And the view has been all along that if a 16 or a 17-year-old member of our community garner the support of their neighbors to vote for them in an election, and for that to be enough support to exceed all of the other candidates, then why shouldn't we allow the people's voice to carry here? I mean, isn't that what we're working on? We're working on voting rights. We're working on expanding the voice of the people. And if the people elect a 16-year-old, then we should honor the people's choice with electing a 16-year-old. So I don't think that we should disqualify 16-year-olds. At the time, we had some discussion with our city attorney and some just lack of confidence around whether or not a 16 or 17-year-old could legally serve as mayor, because the mayor signs legally binding contract agreements on behalf of the city. And there are state contract law, actually not even really laws, but more or less histories that have the force and effect of law that limit 16 and 17-year-olds' ability to sign binding contracts. But the question was not actually out for us on or not in our jurisdiction a 16 or 17-year-old would be prohibited from doing any of their duties as a council member. The only document that you sign as a council member is the ethics disclosure report, disclosing what your assets are, and other than that, there are no legally binding contracts that a 16-year-old or 17-year-old on behalf of the city would be entering into. And so it's my opinion that the community should be allowed to decide who's going to elect them, and voters should be eligible to serve. But we have age restriction corollaries at the federal level as well. You have to be 25, I believe it is, to serve in Congress. You have to be 30 to serve as a senator. You have to be 35 to be president of the United States. And so it isn't unheard of to have age restrictions for serving in office. I just disagree with it. I just disagree with it as a general matter.
Thank you. And then Councilmember Searcy, we do have one more question for you. Just to elaborate a little bit on the role of the Youth Council. I know we'll have Julia later to share her perspective, but.
Yeah, I mean, Julia is the expert, but one of the things that we do ask our youth council to do is to help us with engagement. They offer opinions on different issues that are pertinent to the youth. They've offered recommendations to us on certain issues that have come up over the time that I've been on council. They also host events around engagement, but voter registration, coat drives, things like that. But I would argue that the biggest piece that they do for us is provide us with that youth voice. And there are a number of times when we are looking at certain things and it's like, someone talk to the youth council about this? Like, just to make sure that what we are doing kind of aligns and kind of helps to inform and understand that youth voice. And so those are just a few of the things that the youth council does. Again, Julia lives this thing day in, day out, but they come to the council meetings, I believe once a quarter, and provide us with readouts on things that they're working on. Again, they've written us formal letters around certain issues and things that they would like for us to see. So it is a very engaged group, and we on council do take their opinions very seriously, especially as it pertains to outreach and issues that come up related to youth matters.
And then one last question, I think, for now on youth council. Are they appointed or elected?
So they are appointed. So they're considered a council committee. So we appoint them. I will say we often receive more requests for membership than we often have space to accommodate. And so what we try to do as a council, there's a subcommittee that typically looks at the applications that come through. The youth have to justify or write up why they want to be on the youth council. We look at criteria such as where they live in the city and try to make sure that we have ward representation. We look at age to make sure that we don't have a bunch of seniors, too many young, we try to make sure that there's a mix there. We look at racial background and other socioeconomic factors to try to make sure that there's diversity within the group. And we look at their rationale for why they want to join and what it is that they're interested in. And I was fortunate enough to be on the subcommittee to review the last round and to hear the youth talk about things like housing affordability, rec center development, sustainability. Like, you have 16-year-olds, 14-year-olds that want to be on the youth council because they want to inform the city's sustainability policies. Like, mind blown. I'm like, when I was 16, I just wanted to go to the mall. So it's just to say how you will be in awe at the type of youth that will, if given the opportunity, will show up. And they come from such various backgrounds that it is so, it's really, it makes you very proud to be able to make those decisions around selection.
Great, thank you. Now we have the mayor with something to say.
Well, I'm sorry I was a little late. I'm just sort of blown away at the quality of this presentation. I want to thank Amalia for putting it together. I want to thank our amazing Lucy Freeman, who was the inspiration originally and lobbied me to get me to support this idea. I do want to recognize our council president, Circo, and Councilmember Barr, who've attended, and the other council members. As you know, this is being recorded, and they will be very interested in watching it. I do want to recognize my colleague, Councilmember Searcy, very impressive councilmember from Tacoma Park. Pay attention to her, everyone, and the other panelists. One thing I did want to say that I also support 16-year-olds being able to serve in office, but I do think that there's some kind of legal restrictions, but that doesn't mean that we can't be lobbying our state senators and delegates to change that law. So that's something we should all be thinking about for the future. I also, in terms of, I know that I think eventually we might want to consider having a youth council in our town, and I do think that those requirements for service. I mean, really, we should have those requirements for all committees, not just the youth committee, so that we get the best possible committees to serve. So That's all I wanted to say. And thank you everyone again. And also I'm so glad so many of our residents are tuning in. And I hope you will urge all your friends and neighbors to follow the recording, because it's very important. This is really important stuff. And thanks a lot. I'll turn it back to you, Amalia.
Thank you, Mayor Slavin. So now we're going to hear some of the younger people's perspective. So Andreas, if you could just kind of tell us about your experience with lowering the voting age in your town, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. So this past March, the town of Chevy Chase officially lowered the voting age to 16. That includes myself and many other teens were allowed to vote in this past town council election. Some other things that got passed with the charter amendment is that 16-year-olds are also eligible to run in the town of Chevy Chase. And along with that, non-citizen 16-year-olds are allowed to vote in the town of Chevy Chase. But for my experience, it was a process where a lot of people brought arguments up of saying, you know, why you? Why does a 16-year-old have the ideas to push this forward? And I think the best kind of way to put it is in 10th grade, we all learn about the US Constitution. We learn about everything in the backbone of democracy. So why not apply it? Why not apply it to a firsthand, pretty simple way to really see democracy in action? So it's very popular in other countries, including Austria, Argentina, Belgium, Malta, Ecuador, Brazil, Scotland, and Wales. All of those countries have 16-year-old voting ages. And there's efforts in Canada and Germany to pass it as well. But I think the main thing to look at is teens want to get involved. There's a town teen committee here in Chevy Chase that is very active in creating different drives, whether that be for clothing or food. And people want to listen to what they have to say because it's the future. And if the future is kind of disagreeing with what's going on now, why not try to kind of create that bond? So that's my experience with lowering the voting age.
Great, thank you. And how did it feel to vote for the first time?
It felt great. It felt great to finally have a say in what's going on around me, and especially with local traffic laws at that point was a huge kind of debate point, and it was great as a driver to be able to have a say in that.
And then before you voted, did you do anything to prepare? Can you tell us what you did?
Yeah, I knew kind of who was running just due to the fact I was so involved with a lot of the town council members already going into the process. So I just kind of looked at who was arguing for what and what I kind of agreed with going forward, and I made my decisions.
Great. And does anybody else have any questions for Andres? If you do, put them in the chat and I can ask them for you. Okay, I'll give it one more second. Okay. I think I'm going to move on to Julia now, and it's okay if you still have questions for Andres, you can ask them later. So Julia, I know a lot of people were interested in youth council earlier, and you are really involved in that. So if you could just tell us about that, about voting, since you're over 16, all of that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm in a fortunate situation where I did not have to promote, the 16 law in, right? So, which is a blessing, obviously. And I think it's great what, Amalia, you and Andreas have been doing. I think that's just incredible. And I hope that it all works out well. So being on the Tacoma Park Youth Council for probably the past 2 years has been really interesting because Tacoma Park is a great community, and it's felt so tight knit to be so close with council members and everything like that. And I think that this year for the council, I think we want to expand and sort of similar to what council member Searcy was saying, of connecting the youth more together instead of just being on the committee, but to kind of branch out a little bit more and figure out ways to involve everybody, right? Not necessarily have to be on the council to be involved. Over the past year, we did a voter registration event. And so we're going to figure out how can we get the message out that if you're 16, you can vote in the local elections. And I think we had a lot of, people coming up saying, I can vote, I'm 16, I'm not 18 yet, right? So, and making that a really known thing. And I hope that, as more towns around us, because we're so close to DC, because we have so many teens that are so involved and so knowledgeable on so many different, topics relating to politics. I hope that, we see more of that going forward, of the voting age getting lowered to 16. Because I think that I've been surrounded by so many like-minded individuals, and it's just been incredible to see kind of how they, their opinions are so, educated, it's not just sort of surface level stuff, and so that's basically, my experience for the past couple of years. So, yeah.
Great. Could you tell us what made you join youth council?
I've always been interested in local elections. Like, me and my father would always go to the Wednesday night council meetings, and I was just like fascinated by the whole thing, and the public comments. It just was something that I was so interested in. And so I wanted to kind of get to know the council members more and the process and, the fundamentals of local government, because it's literally right down the street, so I just was, interested in that part of it. Yeah.
Do you think that there are opinions that the youth council brings to the regular council in Tacoma Park? And if so, what are these opinions? How do you think they influence?
Sure. I think this past year, we did a lot more of learning about the local government instead of impacting it quite, a little bit more of learning about, because we had a little bit of a younger crowd. So I think introducing what their issues were and just learning about it was more what we did. So we hope to this year, to kind of be a little bit more opinionated on things. And I think that's sort of the goal for this year. So I can give you an update in maybe a year or something of those things. Yeah.
I think we'd love to hear that. So can you just tell us a little bit your experience with voting? Do you do anything to prepare? How is it going through the process?
So I haven't quite voted yet. I'm 17, but when I can, coming up, I will definitely read up on it. And since, I have close connections, I can really learn, the inside scoop of everything, which is very exciting. So that's definitely to read up on it a lot and discuss with other members on the council is something that we've done a lot in the past year as well. Yeah.
Great. And then we had another question come in. I think this is not directed to you in particular, Julia, so don't feel pressure to answer it. So someone mentioned that since 16-year-olds don't typically pay taxes, should they really be voting? So if anybody has any thoughts on this, feel free to jump in.
If I jump in real quick, I say that I worked a summer job this summer and I did pay taxes on said summer job, but I don't think that paying taxes means the most about who has a right to say things about local issues. We are very much affected by local decisions, and we have a driver's license. We are responsible for many things in or outside the house. So I just wouldn't say that taxes are not like the biggest topic to kind of look at.
Great. And if anybody else has anything they want to jump in, feel free to do so. Same goes with questions. If you guys have any questions, put them in the chat. You can feel free to unmute yourself. Don't be shy.
I'll just, the issue of taxes can be a complicated one, but I mean, another thing to think about is, I think if you talk to some local business people, 16 and 17-year-olds spend money in the community. Certainly are paying sales tax, and in addition to, any taxes from their wages, and so that's a part of it. I know that my teenagers, when they got to be about 16, started spending a lot more money in the community. And if that's typical of other places, that's another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I never found the taxes argument to be very convincing, to be honest. We don't ask this question of 19-year-olds. We don't ask this question of any other, individual or class of individuals. And so, I think that the underlying idea is maybe that and I don't mean, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the idea, right? I'm trying to give credence to what the underlying maybe intent here is. And I think that the underlying idea behind attack and is, do 16 and 17-year-olds have skin in the game? And I think the data really shows that they have skin in the game in a lot of ways, right? Many of the things that we talk about impact them, right? When you have a small town council that manages its police force, how that police force polices has a huge impact on 16 and 17-year-olds who are disproportionately policed. And so, the skin in the game thing is there, and the investment and the engagement in the elections, the data shows us is there. And we've historically seen the problem of trying to attach rights and benefits to things like being a tax holder. Yes, that's the, original way done in our country. And I think that we can all agree it was wrong for us to be a property owning, tax paying white male in order to be allowed to vote. And so, as we have these difficult discussions about where to draw the lines and where to change our voting numbers, the answer is, of course, it's arbitrary to pick 16 over 21, as is it's arbitrary to pick that. I guess I think it's 20 for tobacco, right? And 21 for alcohol, but dying for your country is 18. I mean, it's all these numbers are sort of arbitrary, but we do bestow, right, the basic starting of it at 16 in so many ways. It's not just paying taxes on your income, and it's not just paying sales tax. It's about, starting to become that contributing member of society that we teach in high school is what we're supposed to be doing at that age. And so, I've just never found the taxes argument convincing, because it doesn't, I don't think that the underlying thing is missing, which is skin in the game, investment in the outcome, engagement, meaningful engagement to what's going on. In fact, I think you'd find that 16 and 17-year-olds do that then, especially the 18 to 24 cohort. The data really shows that. But even then, I think that you'll see engagement and investment a lot more than the 30 to 40 cohort, for example, which is the group that I'm in.
Great, thank you. And we had another question come in. This is directed more towards council members, I think. But what was the biggest opposition to lowering the voting age, and how did you handle it?
So I was not on council when the issue of the voting age was determined. However, I was chatting with my council member, who I think was probably one of the lone people who did not vote in favor of it. But his rationale was sound. He actually felt like it should be a ballot issue, and to allow the community to vote. That said, I do know that part of the concerns were it was kind of like the presentation that was given was the Tacoma Park playbook, because every single one of those issues was what was brought up, about are the youth going to just be duplicating their parents' votes? I mean, we already had and still do have disparities across the city geographically in terms of voter turnout. So are you necessarily going to see parts of the city that are already really engaged now have a greater say-so in what happens in the city elections, right? Particularly as it relates to mayoral elections, right? And because now their kids are able to vote. And we're seeing now that that's just not true. So those were some of the concerns around youth's ability and decision-making was also, there's lots of Washington Post articles about these debates in the city of Tacoma Park. But yeah, those were some of the major issues around, can youth understand the issues that are critical for voting, right? And are we, in fact, really enabling double counting, so to speak, of certain parts of the city that already have very high voter turnout? And what I can say, what I've seen directly is those aren't true. Andreas just gave one of the most amazing and eloquent responses as it relates to taxes. It's like, I didn't even have to say a word. I didn't have to go off of mute because that was awesome. And so, you know, to question the decision-making ability of our youth, it's just not fair. I mean, they're learning at speeds that, you know, I'm in the 40s, that we just didn't have the level of information at our fingertips as they do. And so they know more about issues that were, quite frankly, way above what I could understand or fathom at my age, at their age, when I was growing up in the 90s. The fact that there's double counting, where you maybe see, you know, certain parts of the community that may have, you know, voting that's similar in a way, and that's not true either. I've sat in lots of council meetings and I've seen people who are obviously families, but they differ in opinion on a particular issue, and you can see it. And so to think that youth will simply just vote on what their parents, or vote in alignment with their parents, is just simply not the case. We've seen it in the data, but I've seen it in real life. It just doesn't, I mean, you obviously don't have a teenager if you think they're ever going to do exactly what you say do. So it is, it has been a really great experience to see those minds change once it's implemented, and the people who maybe doubted it to see, no, it actually works. It actually isn't so bad. It actually is beneficial to us to have youth able to vote, but also really engage civically in our community.
Great.
Yeah, so I'll jump in too and just say, you know, as a council member, I mean, I should clarify my, you know, I'm speaking in my personal capacity here as a former elected official. I'm no longer on the high council. My day job is, I have a job in the finance department at the city of Hyattsville, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the city. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And I think probably the way I've presented it has been pretty clear. I'm expressing my opinions this evening. But, you know, one thing that, I mean, we had a lot of arguments about, you know, I should rephrase that. There were a lot of arguments made, right? There were a lot of substantive positions proposed that, you know, that we went through, right? I want to say, you know, that it wasn't a big discussion about a lot of the details and had a lot of opposition. We absolutely did, and I'll get into a little bit of what that looks like in a moment. But the big picture story here is that people's opposition was primarily rooted in their own understandings of what's appropriate for a 16-year-old and what a 16-year-old can, like as a matter of mental capacity, do. Not about the civil rights or where the line should be drawn or whether 16. I think everyone kind of agreed, if 16-year-olds present the, if we can find that 16-year-olds present the capacity we need, it seemed to be a foregone conclusion. There would be no, you know, in my community, at least I should say, that there would be no, you know, other, you know, real reason to oppose. And so we did have discussions about a ballot measure, but the discussions about a ballot measure were extremely transparently as an effort to kill the measure by people who were opposed. And they said, like, out loud, you know, well, like, we would get enough people to vote against it, right? Not because we agree with, you know, just because we disagree with you. We're against you at the end of the day. And so we want to try to see if we can, you know, sort of play on these assumptions that were prevalent and common in our community. And, you know, where the council decided to go the route of a ballot measure was that we don't put people's voting rights on the ballot. We've made that mistake too many times in this country. We have done it with women's rights, and we've done it with people of color, and we've done it with Native communities, and we've done it with, whether you're property holding, and like that, we have done it so many times. We ought to have learned our lesson by now that you don't put the rights of a minority on the ballot for the majority to decide without the minority even having a voice, right? That is how our government has been structured in many ways to prevent these kinds of abuses of the minority. And so that's the first point. The second point is, when we say the data, we're talking about the results of the Scottish elections, where they did exit polls and found that only 55% in the 14 referendum vote, only 55% of the 16 and 17-year-olds voted consistently with their own parents, right? So when we say the data, we're saying there have been elections where we've seen the results of people actually having less correlation than you'd think. They live in the same house, they probably share a lot of values, right? And so that for me is a surprising result. We're looking at the results of Austrian elections, and all of these sort of support the theory that we have not yet proven, because we haven't had enough election cycles to prove that voting at 16 has a fundamental increase in democratic outcomes across the lifespan and across it. And walk with me here for a second, right, to hear how this works. So we know that no matter when you start lifespan, you create a habit of voting, and you're more likely to vote for the rest of your life. We also know that if you live with someone who votes, that you are more likely to go vote yourself and to cast an independent ballot. And if you're trying of these things, right, there are like scientific studies that we can point to that sort of make every statement that I'm saying here as valid. We know these as facts, right? And so the theory behind it is a 16 or 17-year-old lives with parents who are already more likely to vote because they're in an older voting, older age group, which has a higher voting turnout. They make their kids likely to turn out and cast an independent vote. Those kids then go off to college, or they go out into society, and they live with other people who in the 18 to 24 cohort have a lower voting turnout because they haven't yet, but now they live with someone who has a voting habit. And so there's the doubling on and tripling on and quadrupling on effect of spreading like a disease, right? Voting is a good disease that we want to spread throughout our community. And the idea is that over the course of 30 or 40 years, we'll end up with more voting in the to 18 cohort, the 18 to 24, the 24 to 30, and probably end up averaging out somewhere around there. And this is, of course, like my unscientific assumptions, right? Professor Hammer can actually tell me how close I am to the truth on some of these assumptions. But the cycle of building voter turnout our community is actually what was probably the most proactive convincing argument, right? When you're looking at people's views are primarily, I have these assumptions about why it's bad for people 16 and 17-year-old to be allowed to vote. And so we're going to have those arguments and turn out that brain development is actually complete and for these types of decision making at this age. Other data that we've gone over, then you have to find a reason to support such a move. And the reason to support such a move is we want more people to vote, right? We live in a country whose fundamental value is the voice of the people. And for us to deny the voice of people who have as much of a stake in our police and our potholes in the roads and our recreation services as anyone else, is the same basis of the argument, by the way, for non-citizen voting, which we took on next in the city of Hyattsville. So the last point I just want to make is we actually did have in our city a 9-year-old child testify in support of the measure, and his father on the council was against the measure. And that was a really interesting sort of piece of the story that was featured in the New York Times.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think Lucy had something she would like to say.
Yes. Amalia and the panel, thank you so much. This has really been interesting. I have in favor of the 16-year-olds voting for, maybe a decade, but I've learned all sorts of new facts. And I wanted to speak up. It is the young people who are out there, working, struggling to help us conquer our problems like gun violence, save our planets, reproductive rights, all sorts of reasons that the young, other people have been working for these causes for a long time. But now I think with the young people, we can win with these. And that is why I am so strongly in favor of the 16-year-olds being able to vote. As I think Andre said, in 9th and 10th grade in Montgomery County in the public schools, everyone takes national, state, and local government. So then when they get a driver's license, they register at that time. So we are already having our 16-year-olds registered to vote and learning, having had a year of, should we call it civics, learning about government. And then I would, now I know all these facts behind it, but I think let's let the 16-year-olds get into the habit of voting when they're still living at home. Then when they go to college, it will be easier. Then it's harder. You have to request a mail-in ballot, but they'll already be used to voting. So there are many reasons that I'm so much in support of this, and I hope our council. Oh, there's one other thing. What I was thinking about this when Andre said, I think it was Andre said, if people can vote, they should be able to serve. And that's the other cause I would like to see Somerset work for, to have our non-wet citizens, but who are able to vote, let them serve on the council. We would have a lot of marvelous people wanting to serve. Okay, thank you so much for everyone speaking up.
Thank you, Lucy. And Ralph, I see your hand is up if you have something you want to say.
Yeah, first time I voted was in 1972. And that was only after a constitutional amendment allowing 18-year-olds to vote. All the same arguments against it that we're hearing, all the 16-year-olds are going to band together and outvote their parents. Nonsense. That's not going to happen. They're going to vote in a similar way. If the election is so close that the 16 and 17-year-olds make a difference, it means it's so close. And there was a lot of opinion on both sides among the older people. And the older people, if they'd really wanted to, they could have done something about it. Good for those 16 and 17-year-olds if they're going to go out and make a difference. I love it. So I was able to vote in 1972. They said, oh, they're gonna all vote for the hippies and they won't care at all. And unfortunately, in my opinion, my candidate for president lost that year, lost Maryland and lost nearly every other state. It's just the way it goes. But the having the 18-year-olds allowed to vote, it was a very important thing. And I'm proud to say I have voted in every election, primary and general election, since that time.
Great. Andreas, do you want to chime in? I see your hand is also raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on how a lot of people are talking about elections and how this will sway elections. I just want to make clear, this is not a partisan issue. This is a civic responsibility. And at the end of the day, we're not asking people to vote for one specific person or one specific party. We're just asking for people to allow 16 and 17-year-olds the opportunity to vote. So that's all I wanted to say.
Great. Thank you for bringing that up, since that was an important point. Joe, I see your hand is up.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Amalia, thank you so much. You Your commitment and your passion and your hard work on this issue is pretty extraordinary. And bravo is all I can say. We've been hearing a lot about engagement and participation and more engagement, and must say that it's a little disappointing to see that the average age here of people on this call are closer to 60 than they are to 16 of the town residents. And even with offering them learning points or whatever, they're not here. So it's that, I have to say, is a bit disappointing. I don't know where they are, but school hasn't even started. That was one thing. I had expected this forum, I guess, to be a little bit more all encompassing, in the sense that there would be also people who are not for this, who have got issues or concerns. And I'm not sure that that's exactly the case. I mean, all the speakers have seemed to have wholehearted support for the measure. So I would just like to say a couple of things, is that I tried to do my homework. I've read all these emails that have gone back and forth, and I've talked to my 3 kids who are now older, and then spoke to a teacher in a private school that teaches high school around here. And then I went to my super go-to source, who's my sister, who is the college counselor for a large school district in Maine for the last 25 years. And so she has insights probably better in 16-year-old minds than anybody. And I guess everybody seems to come out with the same thing, which is that when it comes to national elections, 10-year-olds are involved, 16-year-olds are involved, everybody's involved. My kids, everybody I know in their age groups campaign for the presidential election stage, and even sometimes for the state. And that, to be able to give 16-year-olds the right to vote in the presidential election, to me, would be absolutely wonderful. Just because they know the issues, they're concerned, and they've learned about the issues enough to go around canvassing. But that when it comes to local issues, to the nitty gritty stuff of what happens next door, that's a little bit harder. That's a little bit harder to get kids involved. Look at the participation in this meeting. It's a little bit harder. So to me, the suggestion of what's happening in, I guess, Tacoma Park, where there's a youth council, where kids' voices can be heard, the 16, 17-year-olds' voices can be heard, they can participate, is a really good entry point to this kind of participation in local politics. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you to all the speakers. And again, thank you, Amalia, for such an incredible devotion and commitment to this issue.
Thank you. Okay, so we had a few more questions also come in. So one person is curious about kind of the age aspect of this issue. So if 17-year-olds can serve in the military and 16-and-a-half-year-olds can drive, do you have a similar anchor for 16-year-olds? Does anybody have any opinions on that? Do they think that in their municipality 16 was the right age? Do you think it should have been even lower?
Well, here's what I'll say. That we had some discussion in Hyattsville about, about where you draw the line, right? And the reality is, just the absolute truth is that there isn't a standard internationally or even nationally around a lot of these things, right? Where there is local control, is local variance on these issues across the world. And so, we look at places like Germany has an 18-year-old, I believe it is, driving age, and a 16-year-old drinking age. And, we can't, I'm sure someone's tried to do the studies. I'm not trying to make correlation equals causation, but there is, in fact, a much lower drinking and driving fatality rate in Germany, which also has no speed limits on their highways. And so they do things different approach than what we have. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm flip all of our ways around, but I am trying that we arbitrarily decide where to draw these lines. And You know, as a general matter, 16 is one of these sort of rights benefits points in our society. Could it be 18? Could it be 21? Could it be 25? These are all reasonable numbers to decide for various reasons, right? I mean, I think if you want to try and pin all of these arguments around why 18 or 16 or 21 isn't the right age for these, it gets back to basically 25, you know, all the, you know, if you want to be absolutely sure, 25 is probably the number for brain development and all those things, and none of the voting age to be 25. I think that's a generally unaccepted and unacceptable answer. And so, you know, why 16? Well, why have we decided that 16 is working for a business, except that if you do certain jobs, you can be 14 or 15 in certain industries, right? Why is it that we decide that that's the age in which you can start to take driving lessons and drive what I consider to be a deadly weapon? And I was taught when I was a kid that it's a deadly weapon. It's proven in recent society to be more alarmingly true than I ever thought. We allow people to do all kinds of things, and voting, I actually think isn't it sits differently, and it sits differently in a way that is as a privilege, you know, but voting is a right, and more than a right, a social obligation that we have. And so, you know, 16 is an arbitrary number, but it ties to where both, you know, the brain scientists tell us that we're capable of making the kinds of sort of reasoned decisions, and it's the line where we draw a lot of other things in our society. So sort of that's you know, that's why I stand on that particular point. In terms of getting youth engaged and you know, having folks show up and engage in the process, it actually turns out that the youth really do engage more when we give folks the right to vote. That's just proven on a local level in Hyattsville and Tacoma Park. It's also proven on an international level with other communities that have 16 and 17-year-old voting. But even more than that, I'd say, you know, if you were to probably really actually parse the data of how many 16 and 17-year-olds are in your community versus how many people who are above the age, and compare the percentage of engagement in this and other meetings, I bet you'd be shocked that one or two 16 or 17-year-olds, because there are so relatively few in your community, has a higher percentage turnout than the 5 or 6 that normally turn out to your council meetings. And if you've got more than 5 or 6 that regularly show up, I'm blown away, because, you know, we in the city of Hyattsville had about the same 3 people who come to every council meeting, and that was about it, adults or youth or otherwise. And so we have in our communities is a real engagement problem. When I started in the city of Hyattsville, we had 10% turn elections. And when we look at national numbers, sure, those of us who were spending our Monday evening at 8 rights and lowering the voting age, we're super engaged folks. That's absolutely right. But we still see 30-40% of our eligible voters don't turn out in national elections, and like 80-90% don't turn out in our local elections. And so you know, I think that there are fewer youth, and so it feels like there are fewer youth engaged, but you might be surprised at what those percentages look like when you compare the actual numbers.
Thank you. Julia, question for you about Youth Council. How many people serve on it?
I believe this year it was about 11. Yeah, about 11.
Is that like a usual size?
I would say so. I'm not the one that appoints, so I don't know if they switched it this year, but yeah, that's usually around the number of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Don, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have something to say?
Okay, so hi, I'm Don. I am 16. I'm turning 17 tomorrow, but I have a little bit of a strange opinion considering I'm 16. I'm a little bit apprehensive about this whole thing simply because I don't own this house I'm in. I know Patrick just talked about how the whole taxes thing is kind of unconvincing, but when I go, if I have a job, I'm paying taxes to the government, so I should have a stake in the federal government, and realistically probably should get to vote in national elections, but I'm not paying taxes to the town necessarily. And That's one thing. Sorry, I'm thinking too fast. So I'm not paying taxes to the town, first of all. Second of all, I don't own this house I'm in. So I'm not necessarily going to like understand like what, I'm not going to understand it as much as my dad will. Sorry, these ideas are kind of half baked. I got better in my head than I think. And so if I were to get to vote in local elections, I don't really know a lot of the stuff. So even if I'm not trying to vote with my parents, a lot of the information I'm getting will be from my parents invariably. So I just feel like even if kids aren't going to be voting with their parents 100% of the time, parents can like influence their kids, and even if they aren't trying to, because that's their source of information. And I guess the rebuttal is kids should be participating more. But I know for a fact that, for example, my sister turning 16 next year, she's more interested in going to the mall and all that stuff. And I don't know. I just feel like I don't really feel like my opinion on whether like the legal requirements for a deck being built in the town, or the distance between trees that's allowed, or how tall your grass has to be, is really something that I can make an informed decision on. And I would trust every 16, 17-year-old in this call right now to vote, but I'm not sure I'd trust like the average 16-year-old, because in local issues, I mean, forgive me if that was just rambling.
I'm happy to respond. No, Don, I think you will be surprised. There are a lot of adults that live in a city that have no idea or interest in trying to understand how high vegetation should be in a city, or what are the legal requirements for a speed hump. So you are not alone. The vast majority of residents of the city don't know that. Instead, in many cases, what you're voting on is, a person, or identifying a person who you feel, based on what you hear in terms of how they campaign, or what they explain to you, or how they believe the city should be ran, you're investing in voting for them. And there's sometimes going to be referendum items that are on a ballot about certain things that may crop up. But one of the things that's important about having 16-year-olds as the legal age is that then you are on the voter rolls, right? So then as an elected official, or someone who's running for office, I now can say, okay, let me make sure that I get materials to this person, so that about what you're considered a voter now. You're registered to vote. Now we can get information out to you. Now we can explain issues to you. Elected candidates or candidates can go out and kind of provide you with information. So it really does, to some degree, opens up information and makes it more readily available to you, because now you're on those voter rolls, right? Otherwise, you would have to seek that information out yourself, which you still have to do. But when it comes to elections, being on those voter rolls really does help. It helps. I mean, some people would argue it probably doesn't help because your mailbox is full of a whole bunch of pamphlets, but it does make sure that you get certain information to help you to make a more informed decision. So if you're concerned about not understanding those aspects, believe me, you are not alone. I am fielding emails regularly from adults that don't get that stuff. Half the time I'm still trying to learn it myself. So I think that you raise a good point, though, about making sure that we're meeting youth where they are, right? I am not expecting any youth in the city of Tacoma Park to give up being a teenager in order to serve the city. We try our best to make sure that there are provisions to allow for youth to be youth, right? But I think knowledge is power. And the earlier that we can get that knowledge to you, the more empowered you would feel about being able to make certain decisions. So I do think that that is important. And to that point, I know there was a question about the youth council. Julia in Tacoma Park, Julia is correct. We have up to 11 Tacoma Park residents that are able to participate. And we actually allow residents in grades 7 through 12. So it does, to some degree, serve as a bit of a pipeline, our youth council, because it's not just full of 16-year-olds. So you can have younger cohort. And as Julia mentioned, it's a younger group that's in there right now. So you could have a younger cohort that kind of grows up through the council and learns about a lot of different things through participation in youth council or other types of engagement. And then that helps you that when you get to that point where you're 16 or you're 17, you now have been in the pipeline a little bit and you know a little bit more through your ability to engage through other youth activities to kind of feel a little bit more empowered and like you have a little bit more knowledge about how to vote when it is your time to vote. So I do think that, you know, and I think that point was raised earlier by, I believe it was Joe, about creating those pathways and those engagement opportunities for youth so that they can gradually get ready so that when they're 16, they feel far more comfortable with voting and kind of generally understanding local government prior to that time when it's time to vote.
Thank you. Sorry if my question was disjointed. I was a little bit nervous.
Oh no, you spoke very eloquently, and I can assure you, there are tons of adults in the city of Tacoma Park that have no idea how to do a sidewalk petition. So you are perfectly fine.
Patrick, do you have something to add on to that?
I do, yeah. So just a couple of things. First off, Dawn, run for council, because I'm pretty sure that you know more about most of the other candidates who are running for council, right? Fence offsets are one of the things that you have to figure out and manage is like actually a qualification, right? You've earned. Two, I mean, I am more scrupulous in my vote. I haven't earned my vote, but it's a good start. Two, you should consider, because in debate, you can just fire off all your arguments. They encourage you to speak as fast as you can. So that's another sort of second point. I want to tell everyone a quick kind of funny story about my experience on council with this issue. So we had one council member who was against it, whose primary argument was, my 30-year-old daughter doesn't pay attention. She doesn't know what's going on. I go to these council meetings and she says, I don't even know what you're doing in there. You just tell me who to vote for. And if my 30-year-old daughter can't be engaged and I'm on the council, then why 16-year-old with it? And the only thing that I thought about it and was like, the only thing that there is to say in response to this is, do you think we should take the voting rights away from your 30-year-old daughter? Because that seems to me like the only sort of counterpoint, right, to the sort of basis of, well, the people who don't own property, or people who don't have the same world experience as me, or people who don't have the same perspective. Bingo, exactly, right? Because these elected officials, they don't represent people who own property or have a job, right? They represent the people who don't have a job. They represent the people who don't have a house. They represent the people who don't have a voice in what happens inside their own home, right? And so, right, you don't have to know about the fence offset. What you do need to know as a voter is which one of these people is going to care about your opinion on the fence offset. Or maybe you don't care about the fence offset at all, but you do care about what the police are going to do. That's something you might have a stake in. And so, I would love to have an offline conversation with you, because it's like I enjoy the debate and I enjoy the back and forth, and I think you probably do too. But for me, because there are people who do not carry through civic obligations as older adults, for me, for why we shouldn't allow those who want to carry civic obligations to be given the opportunity to do so.
Thank you for sharing that. Kathy, do you have something you want to say? Does anybody have any other questions, comments, opinions, thoughts they want to share?
Well, of course, I have many opinions. I think that's obvious, but I'll choose not to share any more of them at this time.
Malia, I have one question that was emailed to me today, and I don't think anybody's asked this question. So this is kind of for anybody on the panel, I think, that would want to address this. A resident had emailed and expressed some reservations about the proposal to lower the age, and one of their points was that by lowering the voting age to 16, Somerset teenagers would be voting for policies that property owners have to pay for and live with. And what we typically observe is that most, at least in Somerset, teenagers depart for college after high school graduation, and so often don't end up living with the long-term repercussions of their vote. And for 16 or 17-year-olds would move out of town within 1 to 2 years of voting. So is there a disconnect there, and is there an issue? Was that addressed or brought up in previous discussions? And how might you address this resident's concern?
Yeah, this is Talisha. Happy to tackle that one. I think that is a bit of a, it's a kind of a double-barreled issue, so to speak. So you have the aspects of the tax argument, which we've talked about, and I really, Patrick said it earlier. I just really want to reiterate that we really should not link property tax payment to whether or not you have a say-so in the community in which you live. It is something that is often misdirected. I've had that used as an argument against renters being able to have a say. I've had experience with that being a reason why youth, undocumented individuals who are renters or the like, or even, quite frankly, even commercial property tax. Some people don't even count that, right? Businesses, you don't live here, you don't pay, you're not, in essence, you're not a single family homeowner, therefore you do not have a say. And so we really have to be very careful that the people who have a say should be the people who are engaged and live in this community, period. Whether it's for a year or for a lifetime. And so that's the one piece about the property tax argument that I often rebut, because I don't particularly like the concept of what is implied behind the taxpayer argument. But then about the time period in which someone lives in the community, right? That's also a very slippery slope, because I'm pretty sure in Somerset, not everyone are lifetimers, right? So are we talking about the possibility of you leave Somerset and we're throwing out your vote, right? That's just not how things work. I mean, as a community, you're going to have people that are going to attrit in and out. But one of the things that I do think is really important and is different from your, for like your 16-year-olds or youth who've grown up in a community, is that they have, unlike someone who maybe rents for a little bit and then they move on, the youth that grow up in your community, it is home. They are invested. They come back. They come back every summer. They come back. And so because of that, that personal connection that they have to your community, it's a lifetime. It doesn't go away. So, you know, I think the main point is that yes, your 16-year-old, depending on your election cycle, may only get one shot, depending on when they turn 16, and then from there, how your election cycles work. But I will say, I've seen so many of Tacoma Park's youth that served on the youth council that come back. They come back to the city. Even though their parents may have moved, they still come back and they volunteer for different campaigns. They volunteer in the community because they do have that personal connection to our city. So I wouldn't hold the fact that our youth, fortunately, will move on and grow up, right? Because they always know where home is and they typically come back. And so that way they're going to continue to invest in your community for years to come. So I don't see that as a negative. I actually see that as a way of building those generational roots in your community.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to jump in. I think that's a remarkable answer and the most convincing. It's what there's also, when you think about the legal side of it, I studied college student voting, and one of the big things that came out of some research that we did, similar sorts of arguments. Well, people in the college community don't want people to vote there, but you have to be able to vote somewhere. And if I plan to move the day after the election, I can't vote in the place where I'm going to go to. I'm not a resident there yet. And then I think you can start to ask yourself, so as a legal matter, it just, you can't restrict things on those lines alone. I mean, obviously there's other complicating factors here with extending voting rights to 16, but similarly, if you think about it, if someone said, well, I'm leaving town because I'm gonna, volunteer, in the Peace Corps, or I'm gonna go into the military, you get into this other set of arguments that adds extra complications that we shouldn't be worrying about. You're able to, as a resident of the place where you are, engaged in the rights that community says, and you can't think about what the future holds because you're allowed to leave whenever you choose.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, totally co-sign what Seriously said, and I think that what Professor Hammer gets to is that transience occurs across the lifespan for various reasons. People move to retire. People move back home to care for their parents. People, people move about or don't move about for a variety of life reasons. And when elected officials make decisions, they need to take into account both the desires of the community today and the long-term consequences of the decisions that they make. However, when we're asking for a vote at a moment in time for a candidate or on an issue, you are asking not what we think the future of the future community here or a past community here wants, but we want to know what this community wants. And this community is at all times an iterative body of who's here today, right? Who lives in this community at this time. And we do various things to attract businesses to our communities and investment in our communities. We do various things to retain our residents, to make sure that we don't lose folks to the transiency. But when we ask the community for their view on an issue, we're not asking a subsegment of the community. We're not asking yesterday's community or tomorrow's community, metaphorically or actually. We're asking today's community. Who is it? What is it that this community wants today? And we hope that this community takes into consideration the future investments and what the future impacts are going to be. But we have to ask ourselves, what does this community, want today? And indeed, the result of those elections may impact on your retention, right? You give people a reason to stay. And so think about that too.
Thank you to everybody who provided an answer. I appreciate it.
Does anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns? Love to hear them. Or if you're more comfortable putting them in the chat and I can voice them for you, you can do that too. Okay, seeing that there are none right now, I would just like to thank our panel again so much for their time and their really thoughtful answers to all of our questions. So thank you again so much for helping and enlightening us. If you have any questions, you can, not to the panel, to the neighbors. If you have any questions after this that you come up with, you can send them to me. I can answer them. I'm sure some of our panelists would be happy to answer them too. So thank you again all so much for coming, and let your voice be known to the council members. Tell them that you're in support of this, not in support, whatever it may be. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.